This morning you beautifully described the process of awakening, but especially the foundation of how we continue with it by refining our perception. And we've spoken more to this in previous occasion about refinement. And I was wondering if you can speak more about what you mean with refinement. Because what I understand on refinement is with awareness doing something again and again, but by going into it more, the more subtle level opens up. So that's why I understand with refinement is using my awareness to go over it again, and by going over it again, a more subtle level opens up, more detail is visible, more. Is this how you mean the refinement of perception?
It has two levels here that we speak of. Both are applicable. The level which is opened to sensory perception. In other words, this is the level that is opened to the cognitive responses. Cognitive responses. That the organs of cognition are here to provide us with that marvel of experiencing. So yes, and it has that aspect of culturing. Culturing here, it could be also used synonymous to refining. So if we speak about that level first, and then that without which the true refinement doesn't essentially come about. But let us first have this clarity on this, let's say, more coarse, more gross, available to the senses. For example, if I were to share here something based on my own experiences, then somewhere when you begin to practice and learn arts, visual arts in my case, even if it's accompanied by a more traditional way, which includes painting from life, right? Observing, let's say, having a bouquet of flowers and painting that event, or having a still life and painting that, or having going out into nature and painting a landscape, or painting, just anything that would become that object of one's observation. One of the first if you will, lessons that every painter takes, which marks or heralds the passing, almost like initiation rite, from that more amateurish perspective and approach to that what set the professional artist apart from the amateurs. And that is learning how to see. In other words, it's not just taken for granted, I'm already seeing that. We sit down, all of us sat down in front of the landscape or in front of the bouquet of flowers, and we just paint that event. How can there be any new ways of seeing? Well, that's precisely. Why? Because the first observation begins to bring about overwhelmingly rich amount of material that first goes maybe unnoticed, and at first we are arrested just by a sheer, let's say, orchestration. And by the virtue of perception, we capture the whole thing first. We see the whole thing first. And then our attention begins to go to more and more and more and more details. We begins to see variety. If we look at the landscape just outside, we first see that it's, let's say, hills covered in oak trees, or mountains, or a seascape, or just fields covered with flowers. First we see the event as it is, but then we begin to see more and more and more. And this is where it becomes very difficult, because what would you convey? Where would you even begin? Where would you even begin? How do you capture all that? Where will your attention go? So the first, if you will, initiation is the way of seeing. And this is where the first lesson is received. How to see this all. And that seeing here introduces the selectiveness of the process of seeing. In other words, it's being able to filter, consciously, deliberately filter, so as first you can perceive what is the essential that you want to convey. Because otherwise, your perception will drown in the myriad of these subtleties, and you want to convey them, and this is what amateurs do. They go and they get fascinated, there's a tree, and they look at the tree, and it has many branches, and the trunk is very ancient and has cracks and has texture, and then there are leaves. How do you even convey all that in any means, be it watercolor, oil painting, acrylic, what have you, pen, ink? There would have to be first way of seeing. You would have to see and make this decision. How can you decipher from the overwhelming amount of what is being available to your perception to what you then filter and begin to convey onto the paper? This is just speaking of someone who is the job of the visual arts. Example of the painter here. So it is overwhelming, and that overwhelmingness is being tamed by being able to see first, learning to see. First, you learn to squint, and this is what the first thing you receive. Squint your eyes, because you're seeing too much. Too much goes into the retina. You squint your eyes, you begin to see things in a more unified, orchestrated, general way. You see the masses instead of seeing particular. You're seeing the whole. And that is a constant process. The squinting is the first thing that painter learns. And you look, especially if you said, and what that squinting represents here is filtering the inessential, secondary, so that the essential can be conveyed. And the greater is the artist, the greater is the way he or she is capable of sifting through or deciphering or filtering that through their perception, and then simply translating it in visual terms. You see this, just open up. This, for example, comes to me in the most astonishing way in the Chinese landscape painting. You look at it and artists manage to convey the ambience, the atmosphere, the faraway mountains and faraway fields and faraway more mountains and the rivers, and somewhere down there is a creek and a little tea house and maybe maybe a tree in blossom or just in the autumn leaves at the forefront to contrast and to give that perspective. And yet, if you begin to analyze that drawing, if you look at it into the composite components, you will see what the economy of means. A sheer economy of means. A lot is being unsaid. Something is being said, but a lot is said unsaid. A lot of it left unsaid, I meant. This is a high example of the way, because it goes through years and years of practicing, being able to, and the tradition, of course, years of great support. But any painter you take, your favorite painter in the history of art, and you will see how these balancing acts have been resolved over and over, regardless of the change of tastes and prevalent attitudes. How whatever the attention of the artist goes, and it goes not through this photographic-like ability to capture what indiscriminately what falls onto the retina and reflected back onto the screen. No, it's this process, this ability to extract, sieve through, filter through. And this is directly relatable to what we speak about in relation to refinement of perception at the level of the sensory perception. This squinting of the eyes, you might even came across Rumi's verses, whom we mention a lot these days, where he says, or maybe it was Hafiz, I don't remember, doesn't matter, one of the Sufi poets, my friend, you're seeing too much. You're seeing too much with your eyes open. Squint your eyes. Let the sharp contours of your judgmental perception get a bit fuzzier and get, blurred, so that you can see reality for what it is, rather than being drowned in the particularity of what you think you're seeing. It's an amazing analogy here. It's an invitation to see the world through a different eyes. And they say that mystics, or people who are drowned in bliss, they see reality in that slightly veiled perspective. Everything is there, but it doesn't have this painfully sharp edges. It's softened. The gaze is softened. The gaze is not penetrating, it's softened. You see? That filtering is taking place there. It sees everything, whatever is there to see. But there's this softness of the gaze. And it's the first thing that professional visual artist learns, is the way of seeing, or new way of seeing. Because otherwise, reality is overwhelming, always overwhelming. And a visual artist has to be overwhelmed. If he or she is not overwhelmed, then what's the point? It's overwhelming. Look at these flowers first, and then begin to look. Look at the bouquet. Every texture is different. The vibrancy of color is different. There is this cadence and resonance. How it vibrates, how it picks different shapes, suddenly are recognized in other shapes, but only to articulate and disappear, blend into another shape. The varieties of greens, of different greens. And then these are accents on that creamy white roses, then also being echoed in those small little white field-like flowers. How can you even begin to paint that? How can you paint that You see? You would have to begin to translate this into another way. But before, you would have to see it in totality if you are to capture it. Unless you want to go very close and give us only the detail, just at the detail. But even then, you would have to sacrifice everything around it so that your attention goes there. So this is the perception at the gross level. It's perception available to the senses. You're writing something. You're not a painter. You're a man of words, man of letters, as they say it in English language. No, today maybe we should say woman of letters. Woman of letters, so that the feminists are not offended. Or men and women of letters, or women first, women and men of letters. Oops. So you see, the writer's job is not that easy. You have to constantly be aware. Every word you say means something. Every word has vibration. The same, like every color, every hue has vibration, every word has vibration. Words put together could convey a rhythm. One can perceive a cadence. There could be even music in the way certain vowels and resonance reappear, where the sounds are opened and where the sounds are collapsing. And yet the job of a writer is still to relate something, to convey. What and where your attention goes as the writer is all that matters. And the same principle here is applicable, is being able to conceive this. What am I going to say? What do I want to convey here? Then how will translate naturally. But if one doesn't know what one wants to convey, then it is open to constant error, because the how only and always subordinate to what. First what, then it will find itself how, because it follows the same. Ikcha, jnana, kriya. Will, then know-how, translates into action. So in the job of a writer, this way of filtering is just as much of value as in the job of a painter. The landscape is different. The landscape is the landscape of internal landscape made out of images and words, vistas of thoughts. What one wishes to relate, what one wishes to convey. And then how best to do it, which means to apply. If writer is fascinating with the language, oh, this word sounds wonderful, oh, I'll use that. Then this is what happens a lot when amateurs write. Then they get arrested at the level of the superficial excitement. A seasoned writer writes the way she thinks, as the thoughts appear. And there is this process of dissolving these thoughts, because they're too quick to appear. They are the first thoughts. You ignore them, they fall back to where they came from. But the process is set in motion. Something else is now coming, but from a deeper place. Maybe the writer goes for a walk, or something caught his or her attention. A sound, a conversation, an encounter, a scent, a meditation. Things settle down. And in that settling down state, something is being touched and re-emerged or re-emerging on its own. Then the writer doesn't even need to think. All he needs to do is to write. Write. Because now the job is done for him or her. This is when perception at that level reaches certain refinement, because the writer managed to tap into that reservoir where something of value presents itself. It asks, begs to be released out of that molten state of possibilities, to be cast out into something which then brings things alive, ignites our imagination, inspires us, soothes us, connects us to the depth of our own feelings and sensations and thoughts. This is when we are exposed to true writing, or good writing. Let us now make a pause here and speak of the another dimension, so that the refinement of perception is given a fuller understanding here. Refinement of perception is also spoken here in terms of celestial perception. Beneath every sensory experience, beneath every sensory perception for which we are marvelously equipped with these organs of cognition, there are blueprints where the senses gain their provenance. This belongs to that internal order of things. It is imperceptible through the senses. And the refinement here heralds the phase of tuning the nervous system to such degree where these celestial templates begin to reveal themselves in the myriad of celestial sounds, celestial visions, celestial sense, celestial sense of touch. All sensory perception available at the gross level, which necessitates the activity and acuity of the working of the organs of cognition, are not required here. It is perceived when senses in fact are withdrawn. When the senses are withdrawn. So this celestial perception or celestial perceptions is tapping directly into these templates, tapping directly into that where all this otherwise has its origins in terms of the physicality of the world. So it's a very subtle affair, extremely subtle affair, but it is part of the transformation of consciousness. And not everyone may go through this in the same degree. Not everyone may go through this with full gamut of tapping into this. Some people will have more charged with sound perception, with the manifestation of celestial sounds, myriad of sounds, in Sanskrit spoken of as nadas. Other people might perceive internal lights more acutely, more directly. Some may even perceive the celestial fragrances. Some will be in the direct presence of that celestial sense of touch that is beyond, obviously, the sense perception of the organ of action and organ of cognition. Organ of cognition here is skin, and organ of action of touch is hand, right? But it is not perceived. There's no sense of touch is required. No touch is required. It's a different kind of touch. So these are the perceptions at the level of refinement, where the provenance is beyond the reach of the senses, yet where the senses themselves gain their strength, origin, and everything. So that is what and why it is spoken of as celestial, because they do not belong to the physicality of this world. So this is why we speak of it as it has two dimensions. The physical dimension, that of which we spoke now as what could be cultured. And this other dimension, which obviously cannot be cultured, it can only be enjoyed. It can only be savored when and how it unfolds. It cannot even be brought about by someone's wish, desire, or effort. It's a result. One would even say a byproduct of awakening.
The celestial perception, is it also at the same time, can it also be sensed at the same time during the normal physical perception? Or is it only an internal experience during meditation?
Okay, so we kind of like, maybe we'll run ahead of time a little bit, right? Or maybe but there's no harm, because after all this is an advanced program and we can speak about certain things without being afraid that someone may run into hastily made conclusions. And this celestial perception, they may manifest as they normally do as a byproduct due to this acute purification. And they will herald this very, very refined state. But what happens? Only some of them will remain. I would take the audacity to say that only the sound light will remain. Everything else will fade away. But what happens is that when we go through this phase, and when that phase is complete, something interesting happens. Because in the aforementioned process of the descent, when the reclaiming of the organism, the reclaiming of the physical structure takes place, what happens is that this, what is or has been experienced as celestial, and that what is experienced as domain of this sensory, they become one and the same. So in other words, the perception, full stop, itself becomes for what it is. That's what also the poet meant when to see infinity in a grain of sand and in a blade of grass. So that infinity no longer confined, that infinity no longer hidden, that infinity is now directly perceived, as it has been said, in the grain of sand and in the blade of grass. So there is no need to have this, if you will. Therefore, those who really speak about this, they speak about this as the most natural of states. And this is what makes it so subtle as well. Naturalness. It's natural. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, for example, was not that keen on the word mystic or mystics. And I have my take on that. It's also because that would mean someone speaks of oneself or assumes or somehow encourages or somehow agrees to be related to in a third person. Because mystical experience or mystical perception can only be spoken from the mundane level of consciousness. But if you live that already as your reality, how can it be spoken of as mystical? It's your reality. Why would that be mystical? So it's a kind of excess of a language. I'm a mystic. There is a mystic in the air, as Bob Marley sang, but that's a different story. Right? Bob Marley didn't say, I'm a mystic. Right? So this is why when people kind of call themselves mystics, I always have a tongue in cheek. I always wink to Maharishi in my, it's a funny thing. Wow, mystic, are you mystic? Well, then it also would be true to say that everyone is a mystic, because that one's perception isn't completely that. I cannot be one mystic and you're not mystic. Then that something is really, really not congruent there. You see? So, therefore, there is no need to have this celestial perception when things adjust themselves, when the focus is adjusted. Then mystical, celestial, physical growth becomes one thing, one and the same. It has the same flavor, the same taste. One taste is spoken of in Buddhism.
So, what I can do for the refinement of perception is what you said in the first part, like learning to see, learning to perceive the difference and seeing the whole. And the second part is is something that happens during awakening.
Yes, you innocently give it to the naturalness of the unfoldment. It will come on its own time when it has to come. Because this we cannot force. You see? This we cannot force. But there is this noticing how things become subtler. And it is translated immediately, even if for a moment in our realm, this shared realm of the waking state. It's the same and yet it's not the same. There's this extra dimension. There's like more light, more luminosity. More luminosity. If you want, I will share with you something here. This maybe will give you a little bit more of a... Because then some will recognize this. When I was on a TMCT course, back in my home country, back in my birth country, in Uzbekistan, I was staying at my mother's apartment. It was non-residential course, and we would just go there every day, spend full day there in that school, which was served as a venue. And the course was held in November. So already it's early evenings, right? Dark and cold, rainy as well. What I've realized also when I returned there, that I grew up in a kind of a Soviet ghetto. But when you grow up somewhere, you don't know the difference, so you don't even know the word. And everything looks smaller there. Everything looked smaller. The communal areas, the staircases, the apartments, the bathrooms. The bathrooms were ridiculously small. So how on earth this was, like everything smaller there, smaller. I was living in London, I was living a different life, Well, not just in London, lived and traveled. So it's kind of like haven't been there for many, many years. And by the time when I was there, that area really got dilapidated further, It's just also transitory time. Still, it was only less than 10 years after the independence, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Like every day, if I go that way, I pass by big, like garbage land. I go that way, there's another big, like people just dump things, So, not really a place for aesthetic delights, if you will. And I remember that day when there is very palpable, strong, rapturous experience of bliss. That Ananda has fully been experienced. This, this rapture of initiation. I spoke about that. You may have heard this elsewhere spoken. The intensity. So I go back, and it's already deep dark, and I go down that street into the neighborhood, and everything kind of the same, but it has this strange light there. Not physical light. The things are more luminous. Even by passing by garbage land, this whole wasteland, it has different silhouettes, different shapes. And then there's a group of men standing, smoking pot or something, and they, oh, it's you, man. It's like guys I grew up with. Immediately, of course, some of them I maybe have bumped into, but there's suddenly like 4 or 5 of them, and they're just standing in a kind of like, leaning against the wall, and just all look much older than I remember them. Older, fatter, out of shape, right? This is all, of course, interpretation of the situation post factum. But simultaneously, there's this witnessing took place, how all this was lit by this, well, I don't want to say extraordinary, but it felt extraordinary because it was transforming the ordinary into something else internally. I came and I like shook all their hands, like gave, kind of like, hey man, like this, we played as kids. Some of them are alcoholics, completely drug addicts. Probably most of them. Living there, like just standing, hey man, wow. One of them said, man, Igor, what's wrong, man? You're shining. Look at him, he's shining. And I'm standing there, it's like, in that state, there was no preference, no rejection. If I walked there in the morning that day and I saw them there, I wouldn't even want to come and say hello, because it just would have felt to me, this is like, yes, it's not exactly my brothers, with just guys I used to hang out with when I grew up, but the life took different course. But in that moment in time, reality had another dimension. Something else opened up. And that something else, these sharper edges were blurred. You see? Not what we spoke earlier. Everything was perceived through that, if you will, sfumato, through that veil of bliss. So that bliss inevitably was perceived in these beings, in these guys, in this wasteland, in this concrete, in this, in this apartment, in that whole thing. It stayed with me, that experience, because the acuity was so strong. Before that, it was very hard for me to be there. It was this heavy feeling on the heart. Often when you go to somewhere where you grow up, one way or the other, karmically, it doesn't have to be a place where it is associated maybe with poverty or some kind of, because for me it was a fabulous upbringing. I didn't know it's ghetto. It was fantastic. We played. There was no toys in the house. We kicked the ball, We entertain ourselves in such a way that I wish my son will never entertain, because I'll have more gray hair, We did things which were dangerous all the time, because that's what happens, in these kind of settings. All the time. As soon as you're 12 and you're a guy, then you go and you do dangerous things, because it's boring to sit at home and watch TV, right? Unless it's a Godfather showing dubbed in Russian. Then it's fun. But something else happened. So that from that day, this whole was like healing, great healing. That what was considered to be as, like it was transformed. There and then, reality was transformed. And it's November. Uzbekistan is a very beautiful country in the summer, in spring. But it's like November. Leaves already have fallen, black trees, wet. Lights are flickering, not working. So it's like everything was the antithesis, the opposite of otherwise. And in that, there was this bliss. And this bliss was predominant experience. In that moment in time, it was transforming everything. You see? So, this is why we cannot force these experiences. They simply happen. And I just wanted to share this because of that element of the same and yet not the same. doesn't need to be experienced in such acuity, because in many interviews and in talks about this, I've spoken how tradition defines this in 3 distinctive ways: violent, medium, and mild. All awakenings follow this of violent, medium, and mild, or gradual. Because it was extreme, intense, known as violent, this was experienced in such a way. But it doesn't have to be. The same quality can be experienced in a mild way, in a medium way. That's what matters. Sometimes people ask me, oh, wouldn't it be more preferable for it to be in that way how it was with you? I look back and I think, well, you have to be careful what you're asking. One has to be careful what one is asking, because it may seem preferable in many ways, but unless one really, really has all that it requires for the fuses not to be blown, then other ways are more preferable. Other ways are more preferable. I could say that there was a lot of ojas, a lot of understanding already to hold this, to withhold this. And yet, 2 years of almost daily mourning for the loss of that what will never return. That's how long it took in that very extreme overtake. So therefore, sometimes I say medium way is more preferable. Middle way is more preferable. Gradual maybe will take a whole life. Most likely, a whole life. But middle way or medium is still more preferable. So these experiences of same, everything is the same, and yet it's not the same. Tap into that, savor that. Don't create moods, but just savor that. Something else. The field renders itself and opens, and something else is released where that refinement really comes from. So, the part that is open to you, all of you, is the part which is open to the culturing and refining of the sense perceptions. Therefore, Vedic culture is an extraordinary culture of the refinement or the ways of how things can be tuned through all this, implementing all this understanding so that the richness of experience is lived. Ennobling sounds, ennobling aromas, ennobling tastes, so that the palate is clean to perceive this, to enjoy this. This is why there is a tradition of fragrances, tradition of aromatherapy. Aromatherapy is called shortcut to a balanced state. Shortcut, because sense of smell relates to gandha, the earth element, and it's the base element, it's the grossest element. So the sense of smell very quickly can change any emotional state. it assists in creating that internal state of balance and beatitude. This is why perfume industries bloom, because we are naturally wired. We are wired to all this. Our culture could be seen also from the point of view how, in principle, we are wired for all this goodness. The only thing is, we seek shortcuts in this age of Kali Yuga, and everything begins to be supplemented with cheap and cheerful, cheap thrills, chemically produced tastes, chemically produced aromas, and whatever else where our senses cannot find refinement. If our senses are exposed to this nasty stuff, because it is nasty, then bluntness sets in. Only more acute experience will be required. This is why it's so wonderful to smell the variety of jasmines, real jasmine, and real herbs, real tastes. So there are refinements here all the time. Real colors, real shapes, real sounds. So the Vedic culture is extraordinarily rich about this. Sounds that accompany, that are there, the sounds of nature, these rhythms. So there's a lot of room here to explore, a lot of room here to grow. And when the celestial perception needs to come, it will come. But at least we are not missing on this wonder of what's available at this level.
So is it through celestial perception where compassion cracks open?
We don't want just sort of begin to create confusion or begin to mix apples and pears. Because when we speak of perception, right, perception is pertinent to experience for what we are provided with the organs of cognition for the sake of the expression of the senses. Compassion is something else. So compassion is something else. It's the quality which has nothing to do with otherwise instrumentality of the body. You see? Compassion is the quality of the, let's say, evolved mind. It may come as a surprise because it should be evolved heart. But when we speak about this, heart and mind are the same. Heart and mind are the same here. It just needs to be brought back into tuning. When we're out of whack, then there is the mind and there is the heart. Hence the yoga begins. When we don't know, when we're lost in the head, and yet there is the feeling, the world of feelings and emotions, and we don't know how to reconcile it, then we need to bring the balance because we're out of balance. And when we do bring that balance, we realize that mind and the heart are the same. You may have come across this, some lines that some times ago have been said, that when this takes place, what was it? Mind just feels and heart knows. It's almost like switching the quality. Maybe Lakshman remembers better. Do you remember that quote? Well, yes, from that, when mind sinks in the heart, then the mind has the capacity to feel, to intuit. That's what we mean. And the heart just knows.